Sarah Bennett had learned that dignity was the first thing poverty tried to steal, long before it took your home, your safety, or your hope. She sat on the cracked vinyl bench outside the public library, her daughter Emma pressed close against her side, and watched the autumn rain streak down the glass doors they were no longer allowed to enter. The security guard had been polite but firm. No loitering. No using the bathrooms without checking out books. And with fines on their old account totaling $47, checking out books was impossible. Emma shifted slightly, her hand resting protectively over the small swell of her belly that had just begun to show beneath her oversized hoodie. At 16, she should have been worried about geometry tests and homecoming dresses, not where she would sleep tonight, or whether the nausea that had plagued her for weeks would return. Sarah felt the familiar burn of shame and fury mingling in her chest. She had failed her daughter in every way that mattered, and now Emma carried the weight of 2 lives while living out of a backpack. The rain grew heavier, hammering against the overhang above them. Sarah counted the bills in her pocket for the 3rd time that hour. $23, enough for maybe 2 more nights at the motel on Highway 9, the one with stained carpets and doors that didn't lock properly, or enough for food if they slept in the car again. The car. She glanced across the parking lot to where their ancient Honda Civic sat listing slightly to one side, its back window held together with duct tape, and its engine coughing black smoke every time she turned the key. It had been 8 months since the eviction, 8 months since the landlord had changed the locks while they were at work and school, piling their belongings on the curb like garbage. Sarah had tried everything. She had called every shelter within 50 miles, but they were full, always full, with waiting lists that stretched for months. She had applied for assistance, filled out forms until her hand cramped, sat in offices that smelled of desperation and disinfectant, only to be told she made $11 too much per month to qualify. $11. The difference between help and nothing. Her job at the grocery store paid $9 an hour, 25 hours a week if she was lucky. They cut her shifts without warning, scheduled her during times when Emma needed her most, and looked at her with thinly veiled disgust when she asked for advances. She had tried to find a second job, but no one wanted to hire someone who listed a P.O. box as their address, who showed up smelling of the truck stop bathroom where they washed each morning, who sometimes fell asleep standing up from sheer exhaustion. Emma had stopped going to school 3 weeks ago. The other students had noticed the same clothes worn too many days in a row, had seen her washing her face in the bathroom sink, had whispered and pointed until the humiliation became unbearable. The school counselor had called, threatening truancy charges, talking about child protective services. Sarah had hung up, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the button. They would take Emma away. They would put her in a foster home, separate them, tear apart the only thing Sarah had left in this world. And the baby, Emma's baby, would be born into the system. Just another file in an overflowing cabinet, another child the world had failed before they took their first breath. Sarah closed her eyes against the sting of tears. She was 36 years old, and her life had become a mathematics of survival. How many hours could they sit somewhere before being asked to leave? How many days could they stretch a loaf of bread? How cold would it get tonight? And would the blankets they had be enough? She thought of the years before, when she had been a different person entirely, when she had worn business clothes and answered phones at a law firm, when she had packed Emma's lunches in cartoon character boxes and helped with homework at a kitchen table that belonged to them. That life had ended the day the cancer diagnosis came, not for her, but for her mother, the woman who had raised her alone after Sarah's father disappeared. The medical bills had swallowed everything. Sarah had taken leave from work to care for her mother, watching her waste away in a hospice bed, while insurance companies denied claims and debt collectors called at all hours. When her mother finally died, she left behind nothing but a collection of medical debt that followed Sarah like a shadow, destroying her credit, making landlords turn her away, ensuring that even in death, the illness continued to consume them. The law firm had replaced her. They said they understood, that they were sorry, but they needed someone reliable, someone who could commit. Sarah had nodded, her mother's funeral still fresh in her mind, and walked out of that office knowing she would never walk back in. What followed was a slow, grinding descent. Cheaper apartments in worse neighborhoods. Paycheck to paycheck, then week to week, then day to day. The car breaking down and the repair costs mounting. Emma growing out of her clothes, and Sarah wearing the same 3 outfits until they fell apart. Then the eviction, the final blow that sent them spiraling into a world Sarah had never imagined she would inhabit. Now they lived in the margins, in the spaces between society's notice. They slept in parking lots, moved before dawn to avoid police. They washed in public restrooms, ate food from dollar menus and food banks, or charged their phones at libraries and coffee shops until the staff asked them to leave. Sarah had learned which churches offered free meals, which gas stations didn't chase you away, which parks had unlocked bathrooms after dark. She had also learned that people looked through you when you were homeless. They stepped around you on sidewalks, avoided eye contact, clutched their purses tighter. She had become invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had once been hers. Emma stirred beside her, her breathing shallow. The pregnancy had been a shock, a terrible confirmation of how completely Sarah had lost control of their lives. The boy was gone, disappeared the moment Emma told him, leaving her to face it alone. Emma had cried for days, her face buried in Sarah's shoulder, whispering apologies, until Sarah's heart broke into pieces, too small to count. But Sarah had held her, had stroked her hair, and promised that somehow, some way, they would get through this. That the baby would be born into love, even if they had nothing else to give. That Emma was not a failure, that this was not the end of her story, only a chapter written in hardship. She had no idea how she would keep that promise. The rain began to ease, leaving behind a gray afternoon that felt as heavy as Sarah's thoughts. She stood, her back aching from too many nights on hard surfaces, and helped Emma to her feet. They needed to decide, the motel or the car, food or shelter. There was never enough for both. They walked slowly toward the Civic, Emma's steps careful, her hand never leaving her belly. Sarah unlocked the door, and they climbed inside, the familiar smell of old upholstery and damp blankets wrapping around them. Emma curled into the passenger seat, pulling a threadbare jacket over herself, and closed her eyes. Sarah sat behind the wheel, her hands resting on the cracked steering wheel, and stared through the rain-streaked windshield at the world beyond. Somewhere out there, people were sitting down to warm dinners in homes, with locks that worked. Children were doing homework at clean tables. Mothers were tucking daughters into beds with fresh sheets. It was a world that felt impossibly distant, a dream she had once lived but could no longer touch. The tears came then, silent and hot, sliding down her cheeks as she bit her lip to keep from sobbing aloud. She couldn't let Emma see her break. She had to stay strong. I had to believe there was a way forward, even when every path seemed blocked. A sharp knock on the window made her jump, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned to see a man in a suit standing in the rain, holding a briefcase above his head. He gestured for her to roll down the window. Sarah hesitated, fear prickling along her spine. Men in suits never brought good news. She cracked the window an inch. Yes? The man's expression was professional, but not unkind. Are you Sarah Bennett? Her throat tightened. Who's asking? My name is Arthur Caldwell. I'm an attorney with Morrison and Associates. I've been looking for you for the past 2 weeks. He glanced at the rain, water dripping from his nose. Is there somewhere we can talk? Somewhere dry? Sarah's mind raced. An attorney. That meant debt collectors, lawsuits, more legal trouble she couldn't afford. I don't have any money. Whatever this is about, I can't pay. Caldwell shook his head quickly. This isn't about debt, Ms. Bennett. It's about an inheritance. The word hung in the air between them, so foreign, so impossible, that Sarah was certain she had misheard. A what? An inheritance? Caldwell repeated, raising his voice over the rain. From your uncle, Martin Hargrove. He passed away 3 months ago. Sarah blinked, her mind scrambling to make sense of the name. Martin Hargrove, her mother's brother, the man she had met exactly twice in her entire life, both times at family funerals. He had been a strange, quiet man who lived somewhere out west, someone her mother had spoken of rarely and always, with a mix of affection and frustration. I barely knew him, Sarah stammered. Snosh, that may be, Caldwell said, wiping rain from his forehead. But you're his only surviving relative, and he left you something in his will. A property. Sarah's breath caught. A property. The words felt too large, too impossible to hold. Emma stirred in the passenger seat, her eyes opening slowly. Mom, what's going on? Sarah couldn't answer. She stared at Caldwell, searching his face for signs of a cruel joke, but found only patient professionalism. What kind of property? Caldwell glanced at his briefcase, then back at her. It's complicated. Can we please talk inside somewhere? A diner, maybe? I'll buy you both a meal while we discuss the details. Food. The word cut through Sarah's shock like a knife. She looked at Emma, saw the hope flicker in her daughter's eyes, fragile and desperate. They hadn't eaten since the gas station hot dog they'd split that morning. Okay, Sarah whispered. Okay. 20 minutes later, they sat in a red vinyl booth at Rosie's Diner, the kind of place with sticky menus and waitresses who called everyone Hon. Sarah ordered coffee, Emma a hot chocolate, and a stack of pancakes she devoured with the single-minded focus of someone who hadn't eaten a real meal in too long. Caldwell sat across from them, his briefcase open, papers spread across the chipped formica table. Your Uncle Martin, Caldwell began, purchased a piece of property in Wyoming back in 1987. It's a decommissioned missile silo. Sarah's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. A what? A missile silo, from the Cold War. The government sold off hundreds of them when they were decommissioned. Some people bought them as storage, some tried to convert them into homes. Your uncle bought one for $1,200 at a government auction. Caldwell slid a photograph across the table. Sarah stared at the image. It showed a flat expanse of barren land, dirt and scrub brush stretching to the horizon, and in the center, a massive concrete structure that looked like a bunker half buried in the earth. Rusted metal doors hung open at odd angles, and the whole thing radiated abandonment. He lived there, Emma asked, her voice small. On and off, yes, Caldwell said. Martin was, let's say, a solitary man. He spent most of his life working odd jobs, traveling. The silo was his base, but he didn't maintain it much. When he passed, the property transferred to you as his sole heir. Sarah set down her coffee, her hands trembling. Why me? We barely spoke. Caldwell's expression softened. According to his will, you're the only family he had left. He wanted it to go to someone who might need it. Need it. Sarah looked at the photograph again, at the desolate landscape, the decaying concrete. This wasn't a house. It wasn't even livable. It was a hole in the ground in the middle of nowhere, worth nothing to anyone. What's it worth? She asked quietly. Caldwell hesitated. The land itself is about 40 acres. In that area, rural Wyoming, land values are very low. If you sold it, you might get a few $1,000s. Maybe. A few thousand. Sarah's heart sank. It was more than they had, but not enough to change anything. Not enough for a deposit on an apartment. Not enough to escape the cycle they were trapped in. There are back taxes owed, Caldwell continued, about $800, and the property is in rough shape. No utilities, no water, no maintenance in decades. If you don't want it, you can sign it over to the state. No obligation. Sarah stared at the photograph. 40 acres. A structure, even if it was falling apart. It was more than the inside of a car, more than a motel room they couldn't afford. It was land, solid and permanent, something no one could evict them from. "Is it habitable?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caldwell looked uncomfortable. Technically, it's a concrete structure. It's got walls and a roof of sorts. But there's no power, no running water, no heat. And it's extremely remote. The nearest town is about 30 miles away. 30 miles from nowhere. Sarah looked at Emma and saw her daughter watching her with those wide, hopeful eyes. They had nothing. A car on its last legs, $23, and a daughter about to have a baby in the front seat of that car if things didn't change. "How do I get there?" Sarah asked. Caldwell blinked, clearly surprised. You're considering keeping it?" "How do I get there?" Sarah repeated, her voice steadier now. Caldwell pulled out a map, unfolding it across the table. "It's here, about 2 hours outside of Cheyenne. The access road is rough. You'll need to check in with the county office to get the deed transferred and pay the back taxes." He paused. "Ms. Bennett, I have to be honest with you. This isn't a solution. It's a liability. The structure is dangerous. There's no infrastructure. If you're looking for somewhere to live—" "We're living in a car," Sarah interrupted, her voice flat. "We've been homeless for 8 months. My daughter is 16 and pregnant. This silo, whatever it is, has walls and a roof. That's more than we have right now." Caldwell closed his mouth, his professional mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something like pity. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. "Here's the deed, the tax information, and the keys. There are 2 entrances, one top side and one through an access tunnel. The tunnel was sealed years ago, but the top side entrance should still open." He slid the envelope across the table. "I'm required to tell you that the property is sold as is. No warranties, no guarantees." Sarah took the envelope, her fingers closing around it like a lifeline. "Oh, thank you." Caldwell stood, gathering his papers. He paused, looking at Emma, then back at Sarah. "Good luck, Ms. Bennett. Truly." After he left, Sarah and Emma sat in silence, the envelope between them. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a sky streaked with the last light of day. Emma reached across the table, her hand finding her mother's. "Are we really going to live in a missile silo?" she asked, her voice trembling between fear and something that might have been excitement. Sarah looked at her daughter, at the girl who had become a woman too fast, who carried a life inside her while barely holding on to her own. She thought of the photograph, of the vast empty land, of the concrete tomb waiting for them in the wilderness. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice quiet but certain. "Yes, we are." The decision was made. They would leave in the morning, drive as far as the Civic would take them, and claim the one thing in this world that was theirs. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be possible. But it was a chance, and that was more than they'd had in a very long time. That night, they slept in the car one last time, parked behind the diner where the cook had taken pity on them and let them use the bathroom to wash up. Emma curled against the door, her breathing soft and even, while Sarah sat awake, the envelope clutched in her hands. Inside were the keys to a place she had never seen, a property left to her by a man she barely knew. It was a gift and a burden, a piece of land in the middle of nowhere that no one else wanted. But it was hers, theirs, and tomorrow they would go find it. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Sarah started the engine. The Honda coughed and sputtered, but it started. She pulled out of the parking lot and pointed the car west, toward Wyoming, toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. Behind them, the town that had offered no help, no shelter, no mercy, disappeared in the rearview mirror. Ahead lay only the open road and the promise of a place, however broken, that they could call their own. The miles stretched long and empty as Sarah drove through the early morning, the highway unfurling like a gray ribbon across a landscape that grew increasingly barren with each passing hour. Emma slept fitfully in the passenger seat, her hand resting protectively over her belly, her face pale in the weak sunlight filtering through the windshield. The Honda's engine rattled ominously, a sound Sarah had learned to interpret as a warning that they were pushing the old car to its limits. She stopped only once, at a gas station, where the attendant looked at her with barely concealed suspicion until she counted out exact change for $10 of fuel. She bought a bottle of water and a pack of crackers with the remainder of their money, splitting both with Emma when her daughter woke, groggy and nauseous. "How much farther?" Emma asked, her voice hoarse. Sarah glanced at the map Caldwell had given her, now spread across the dashboard and marked with her own notations. "Maybe another hour. We're getting close." Close to what, she didn't quite know. The map showed nothing but empty space around the property. No towns, no services, just the thin red line of a county road that branched off into what was labeled simply as private access. The landscape had changed dramatically since they left the interstate. Gone were the distant mountains and the occasional clusters of houses. Now there was only flatness, a seemingly endless expanse of pale dirt and scrub brush that stretched to meet a sky so vast it made Sarah feel impossibly small. The wind buffeted the car, pushing against the Civic's worn frame, and she gripped the steering wheel tighter. When they finally turned onto the access road, Sarah's heart sank. The pavement gave way immediately to dirt and gravel, rutted and uneven, barely wide enough for one vehicle. The Honda bounced violently over potholes, and Sarah slowed to a crawl, wincing at every scrape of the undercarriage against rocks. "Jesus," Emma whispered, one hand braced against the dashboard. "Are you sure this is right?" Sarah checked the map again, though she already knew the answer. This was it. The road to nowhere, to a property no one else wanted, to a future she was terrified to imagine. They drove for another 15 minutes, the landscape unchanging, until Emma suddenly pointed ahead. "There, I see something." Sarah's breath caught, rising from the flat earth, like the skeleton of some ancient creature, was the missile silo. It was larger than the photograph had suggested, a massive concrete structure that dominated the barren landscape. The main entrance was a huge metal blast door, tilted partially open and rusted the color of dried blood. Around it, smaller structures had collapsed into rubble, and what might have once been a fence now lay in twisted coils of wire half buried in the dirt. It looked like the end of the world. Sarah stopped the car about 50 yards from the entrance, her hands frozen on the wheel. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emma's breathing grew shallow, and Sarah could feel her daughter's fear radiating like heat. "Mom," Emma whispered, "we can't live here. This place it's terrifying." Sarah wanted to agree. Everything in her screamed to turn the car around, to drive back to civilization, to find another way. But there was no other way. They had $11 left, a car that might die at any moment, and nowhere else to go. "Let's just look inside," Sarah said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "We've come this far." She parked the car near the entrance, and they climbed out. And the wind immediately whipping Sarah's hair across her face. The air smelled of dust and something metallic, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. No birds, no insects, just the moan of wind through the rusted metal. They approached the blast door slowly. Up close, it was even more imposing, easily 12 feet tall and several feet thick, covered in peeling paint and rust. Someone had spray-painted graffiti across it years ago. The words faded now to illegibility. Sarah pulled out the envelope and found the keys. There were 3, each labeled in her uncle's cramped handwriting. Main entrance, lower level, storage. She tried the first key in the massive lock, expecting it to be seized with rust, but it turned smoothly. The mechanism inside clanked heavily, and with a groan that sounded almost alive, the door shifted. "Or help me," Sarah said, and together, she and Emma pushed against the metal. It moved slowly, scraping across concrete, revealing a dark opening that descended into the earth. The smell that wafted up was of damp concrete, old metal, and stale air that hadn't circulated in months, maybe longer. Sarah pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to peer inside. A metal staircase led down into darkness, the walls on either side solid concrete, streaked with rust and moisture. "I don't know about this, Mom," Emma said, her voice trembling. Sarah didn't know either, but she thought of the car behind them, of the night sleeping in parking lots, of the fear in Emma's eyes every time someone knocked on the window. She thought of the baby growing inside her daughter, and the promise she had made that somehow, some way, they would survive. "Going to stay close to me," Sarah said. They descended together, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The staircase seemed to go down forever, spiraling into the earth, and Sarah's flashlight beam revealed walls covered in old warning signs and faded instructional posters. The temperature dropped with each step, the air growing cooler and danker. Finally, the stairs ended at a landing and another door, this one metal and heavy but unlocked. Sarah pushed it open and stepped through into what her flashlight revealed to be a large circular room. The ceiling arched high above them, supported by massive concrete pillars. The floor was concrete as well, cracked in places but solid. Against the walls stood the remnants of old equipment, control panels with dead screens, metal desks rusted and collapsed, and in the far corner, what looked like an ancient generator. "It's huge," Emma breathed, her voice echoing. Sarah swept her light around, taking it all in. The room was easily 40 feet across, and she could see other doorways leading off into darkness, other levels descending even deeper into the earth. The air was stale, but not toxic, and the concrete walls, though streaked with moisture, appeared solid. It was a tomb, a relic of a different era, built to house weapons of mass destruction, now abandoned and forgotten. But it was also dry, protected, and it was theirs. They spent the next hour exploring, their phones providing the only light. The silo was massive, descending several levels into the earth. They found what had once been living quarters for the military personnel who had staffed the facility. Small rooms with rusted bed frames still bolted to the walls. They found a kitchen area with ancient appliances and a bathroom with fixtures long since corroded beyond use. Everything was broken, everything was old, but the structure itself was sound. The concrete walls were 2 feet thick in places, designed to withstand a nuclear blast. They would keep out the cold, the wind, the eyes of a world that had already forgotten this place existed. On the second level down, Sarah found a room that was smaller than the others, more private. It had a window, though it was just a narrow slit that looked out at ground level, letting in a single shaft of dusty light. In that light, she could see the space more clearly. Metal shelves still lined one wall, and someone had left behind a broken chair and a stack of old technical manuals. "This could be yours," Sarah said, turning to Emma. "Your room." Emma looked around, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, I can work with this." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Emma was trying. Despite the fear, despite the impossibility of their situation, her daughter was trying to believe. They climbed back up to the main level and continued exploring. Sarah found a door marked "Storage" and used the second key to open it. Inside was a long room filled with metal shelving units, most of them empty, but a few still holding supplies. Boxes of old MREs, their packaging faded, but intact. Jugs of water, some of them still sealed. Blankets wrapped in plastic, moth-eaten but usable. Flashlights, batteries, tools, rope. It was more than they had owned in months. "Someone stocked this," Emma said, running her hand over a box of canned goods. "Recently, maybe." Sarah thought of her uncle, the strange, solitary man who had lived here on and off for decades. Had he been preparing for something? Or had he simply never gotten around to clearing things out? Uncle Martin must have left it, Sarah said. He knew someone would need it. They carried armfuls of supplies up to the main level, creating a small camp in the center of the circular room. Sarah spread blankets on the concrete floor, creating makeshift beds. Emma opened MREs and they ate, the food tasteless but filling, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt the sharp edge of hunger begin to dull. As the sun began to set, the narrow windows high in the walls let in the last golden light of day, painting the concrete in warm tones. Sarah sat on one of the blankets. Emma curled beside her and looked around at the space that was now their home. It wasn't much. It wasn't what anyone would choose, but it was shelter. It was safety. It was a place where they could lock the door and sleep without fear of being woken by police, or violence, or the cold. "We can make this work," Sarah said, more to herself than to Emma. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you think Uncle Martin was happy here?" Sarah thought about that. She thought about a man so isolated, he chose to live in a missile silo. A man who left everything he had to a niece he barely knew. "I think he was surviving," she said finally, "just like us." That night, they slept on the concrete floor, wrapped in moth-eaten blankets that smelled of dust and time. The darkness was absolute, pressing in from all sides, and the silence was broken only by the occasional groan of metal settling or the whisper of wind through unseen cracks. But they slept. For the first time in weeks, Emma's breathing came deep and even. Her body relaxed in a way Sarah hadn't seen since before they lost their home. And Sarah, exhausted beyond measure, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found a foothold in a world that had tried so hard to push them over the edge. Morning came slowly, the light creeping through the high windows in pale shafts. Sarah woke stiff and sore, but she woke without fear. Emma stirred beside her, groaning as she sat up. "I'm going to look around more," Sarah said. "See what else is here." "You rest." Emma nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, and Sarah stood, wincing as her joints protested. She took one of the flashlights they'd found and began to explore more methodically, mapping out the silo in her mind. The first level held the main living space and the storage room they'd already discovered. The second level had the smaller rooms, including the one she'd designated for Emma. But there were stairs that led down even further, to a third level, and Sarah hadn't yet ventured that deep. She descended slowly, her flashlight revealing walls that grew increasingly damp the further down she went. The third level was colder, the air heavy with moisture, and Sarah could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, she found another landing and a corridor that branched in two directions. She chose the left branch, her light revealing a hallway lined with doors, all of them closed. She tried the first one. Locked. The second, the same. The third door opened to reveal a room filled with more old equipment, circuit boards and wiring cabinets that meant nothing to her. The fourth door was different. This one was marked with a faded yellow and black sign that read, "Authorized personnel only," and below it, Level 4, Access Restricted. Sarah frowned. Level 4? She'd thought they were on the third level. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She tried each of the keys from the envelope, but none of them fit. There was another level, a sealed level that her uncle's keys couldn't open. Sarah stood in the dim hallway, her flashlight beam playing across the locked door, and felt a prickle of unease run down her spine. Why would a decommissioned silo have a sealed level? What had been down there that required restricted access, even after the missiles were gone? She pushed the questions aside. Right now, they had more immediate concerns. They needed to figure out how to get water, how to generate power, how to make this place livable for a pregnant teenager and the baby that would arrive in just a few months. But as she climbed back up the stairs, Sarah couldn't shake the image of that locked door or the feeling that the silo was keeping secrets of its own. For now, they had shelter, they had supplies, they had a chance. And that, Sarah told herself, was enough. It had to be. The first week in the silo tested every ounce of resilience Sarah thought she had, and then demanded more. The romantic notion of having walls and a roof dissolved quickly into the brutal reality of survival without the most basic necessities. They had shelter, yes, but shelter without running water, without electricity, without heat as the Wyoming nights grew colder, was barely a step above sleeping in the car. Sarah spent those early days in a blur of problem-solving that felt like drowning in slow motion. Water became the most immediate crisis. The silo had old plumbing, pipes that ran through the concrete walls like veins through stone, but they were dry and corroded, connected to nothing. She filled jugs from the supplies Uncle Martin had left, rationing carefully, but knew they would run out within days. The nearest town, according to the map, was Sweetwater, population 800 and declining. Aunt Sarah made the drive on the second day, the Honda coughing black smoke as it limped down the rutted access road. Sweetwater was exactly what she expected. A main street of faded storefronts, a gas station with pumps that looked older than she was, and a general store that doubled as the post office. She bought water in bulk, spending money they couldn't afford to spend, loading gallon jugs into the Civic's trunk until the suspension groaned. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a sharper expression, watched her with undisguised curiosity. "You're the one who inherited the old Hargrove place," the woman said. It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in small towns. Sarah forced a smile. "Yes, ma'am. That missile silo." The clerk's lips pursed, as if she'd tasted something sour. Martin Hargrove was a strange man, lived out there like some kind of hermit. Town tried to condemn the property twice, said it was a hazard, but he fought them every time. Sarah's hands tightened on the water jug she was holding. "It's my property now." The clerk rang up the purchase with slow, deliberate movements. "Word of advice? Don't go telling folks you're planning to live there. Child services might get ideas, especially with, well." Her gaze dropped meaningfully to where Emma sat in the car, visible through the store's grimy window. The threat was clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who thought they were being helpful. Sarah paid in exact change and left without another word, her face burning with shame and fury. On the drive back, Emma asked quietly, "Do they all think we're crazy?" Sarah's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "I don't care what they think." But she did care. She cared desperately, because she needed this town, needed its resources, its water, its occasional charity, and she could already feel the judgment settling over them like a shroud. Back at the silo, they fell into a routine born of necessity. Wake with the sunrise, when the first light filtered through the high windows. Eat sparingly from the MRIs and canned goods. Sarah would work on making one small section of the silo more livable, while Emma, still battling morning sickness, rested or drew in the sketchbook Sarah had bought her with the last of their money. Emma's drawings were heartbreaking in their hopefulness. She sketched the concrete rooms transformed, with curtains on the windows and rugs on the floors. She drew the baby's room, complete with a crib she colored in careful pastels. She drew their life as she wanted it to be, and Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell her daughter that wanting wasn't enough. The cold was the next problem. As October deepened into November, the temperature inside the silo dropped until their breath fogged in the air even during the day. Sarah found an old wood-burning stove in one of the storage rooms, rusted but intact, and managed to haul it to the main level with Emma's help. Getting it to work took 3 days of trial and error, of clearing the ancient flue and scrounging wood from the collapsed structures outside. When the fire finally caught and held, when warmth began to spread through the concrete chamber, Emma cried with relief. Sarah held her daughter and pretended the smoke wasn't making her eyes water too. But even small victories came with costs. The wood ran out quickly, and Sarah spent hours each day scavenging, dragging broken fence posts and scraps of lumber from around the property. Her hands blistered and bled. Her back ached constantly. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had already been too thin. Emma's pregnancy progressed despite the hardship, her belly growing rounder while her face grew gaunter. Sarah watched her daughter with a fear that never quite left, terrified that the stress and malnutrition would harm the baby, that they had escaped homelessness only to trap themselves in something worse. 2 weeks after they moved in, the Honda died. Sarah had known it was coming. I had heard the death rattle in the engine for days. But when she turned the key and got nothing but a clicking sound, she felt something inside her crack. The car had been their lifeline, their escape route, their last connection to the world beyond the silo. Now they were truly stranded. She walked to Sweetwater, 30 miles there and 30 miles back, carrying empty water jugs. It took her 2 days, sleeping rough by the side of the highway, her feet blistered raw in shoes that were falling apart. When she finally stumbled into town, the clerk at the general store took one look at her, and something in the woman's expression shifted. "You walked?" Sarah could barely speak through her cracked lips. "So a car died." The clerk filled her water jugs without charge and gave her a ride back to the silo in a pickup truck that rattled almost as badly as the Honda had. She didn't speak much on the drive, but when she dropped Sarah off, she pressed a $20 bill into her hand. "For the baby," the clerk said gruffly. "Tell your daughter to take care of herself." It was the first kindness anyone had shown them in longer than Sarah could remember, and it broke something in her. She cried the whole walk from the road to the silo entrance, tears streaming down her face until she had no more left. Emma was waiting at the top of the stairs, her face pale with worry. "I thought something happened to you." Sarah pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tight. "I'm okay. We're okay." But they weren't okay. The isolation was crushing. The work was endless. And every night, as Sarah lay on the concrete floor wrapped in thin blankets, she wondered how long they could survive like this. It was Emma who first brought up the locked door again. "I've been thinking about level 4, she said one evening as they huddled around the stove, eating beans from a can. Why would Uncle Martin have keys to everything except that? Sarah had wondered the same thing, but had been too focused on survival to pursue it. Maybe it was sealed when the government sold the place. Maybe he never had access. But what if there's something down there? Emma's eyes brightened with an excitement Sarah hadn't seen in weeks. What if he left us something? Money, or supplies, or, I don't know, something that could help. Sarah wanted to dismiss it as fantasy, but the hope in Emma's voice was too precious to crush. Even if there is, we can't get in. The door's locked and we don't have the key. We could try to open it, Emma said. You're good at fixing things. Sarah laughed, the sound bitter. I'm good at duct tape and prayer, Em. That door is solid steel. But the seed had been planted. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself thinking about it more and more. What if Emma was right? What if Uncle Martin had left something valuable in that sealed level? Something he couldn't access himself, but knew would eventually be found? It wasn't rational, but desperation rarely was. She began exploring the third level more thoroughly, searching for alternative access points, ventilation shafts, maintenance tunnels, anything that might lead to the sealed level below. The silo was a maze of corridors and rooms, many of them filled with debris or flooded with groundwater. She navigated by flashlight, making mental maps, discovering spaces that hadn't been touched in decades. In one room, she found old technical manuals, their pages yellowed and brittle. Most of it was incomprehensible, diagrams of missile systems and launch protocols. But one manual caught her attention. It was labeled Facility Operations and Maintenance and contained detailed schematics of the entire silo. Sarah spread the manual on the floor and traced the levels with her finger. Level 1, the main entrance and living quarters. Level 2, operations and storage. Level 3, mechanical and life support. And below that, marked clearly on the schematic, Level 4. But Level 4 was different from the others. The schematic showed it as a single large space, with no subdivisions, no rooms, just one massive chamber. And along its walls, the diagram indicated something labeled Vault Storage Systems. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. Vault storage? What did that mean? What had been stored in a decommissioned missile silo that required a vault? She showed Emma the schematic that night, and they pored over it together, their heads bent close in the flickering firelight. Emma's finger traced the access points. There, she said, pointing to a narrow shaft labeled Emergency Access/Ventilation. That goes from Level 3 to Level 4. If we could get into that shaft, we could climb down. Sarah studied the diagram. The shaft was marked as 18 inches wide, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. And there was no indication of where the access point was on Level 3. Even if we find it, Sarah said slowly, it could be sealed, or flooded, or collapsed. Or it could be open, Emma countered. Mom, we have to try. We have nothing to lose. Sarah looked at her daughter, at the determination burning in eyes that had seen too much hardship. Emma was right. They had nothing left to lose. The search for the ventilation shaft consumed the next week. Sarah mapped every inch of Level 3, crawling through spaces barely large enough for her body, shining her flashlight into darkness that seemed to swallow the beam. The silo felt endless, a concrete labyrinth that had been designed to confuse and disorient. She found things that made her skin crawl. Old gas masks hanging from hooks, their rubber degraded into sticky black residue. And rooms filled with equipment she couldn't identify, all of it corroded beyond recognition. In one corner, she discovered a door that opened into a shaft dropping straight down into water, so black and still it looked solid. But she didn't find the ventilation access. Emma helped when she could, though Sarah tried to keep her away from the more dangerous areas. The pregnancy was showing now, Emma's belly round and prominent, and she tired easily. But her determination never wavered. She searched the rooms on Level 2, looking for alternative routes, and spent hours studying the manual, trying to decode the technical language. It was Emma who finally found it. She had been exploring a section of level 3 they'd dismissed as collapsed, a corridor partially filled with debris and standing water. But she'd noticed something Sarah had missed. The debris wasn't random. It had been piled deliberately, as if someone had tried to hide what lay behind it. "Mom!" Emma's shout echoed through the silo. "Mom, come here!" Sarah ran, her heart hammering, terrified something had happened. She found Emma standing in the flooded corridor, pointing at the wall behind the debris pile. "Look," Emma said, her voice shaking with excitement. "There's a grate behind all this junk." Sarah waded into the water, which rose to her knees and soaked through her jeans with icy cold. She began pulling away the debris, old metal panels, and broken furniture, and as she cleared it away, a ventilation grate emerged. It was 2 feet square, covered in rust, but intact. Her hands trembled as she pulled on the grate. It didn't budge. She tried again, putting her full weight into it, and felt something give. With a screech of protesting metal, the grate tore free, revealing a dark shaft that descended into the earth. Sarah shone her flashlight down. The shaft was exactly as the schematic had shown, narrow and vertical, with a rusty ladder bolted to one wall. The beam of her light didn't reach the bottom, disappearing into darkness that seemed to have no end. "That's it," Emma breathed. "That's the way to level 4. Sarah's excitement warred with fear. The shaft looked unstable, the ladder ancient. One wrong move, one rusted rung giving way, and whoever climbed down would fall into that darkness with no way to stop. "I'm going down," Sarah said. "No." Emma's hand closed on her arm. "You're not going alone. Em, you're pregnant. If something happens." "If something happens to you, what am I supposed to do?" Emma's eyes were fierce. "We do this together, or we don't do it at all." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to protect her daughter from yet another risk in a life that had been nothing but risk for too long. But she saw the steel in Emma's expression and knew there was no point. "Together," Sarah agreed quietly. "But I go first." They prepared carefully. Sarah tied a rope around her waist, securing the other end to a pipe on level 3. If she fell, the rope would catch her, at least in theory. She tested the first few rungs of the ladder, feeling them shift under her weight, but hold. Emma stood at the entrance to the shaft, her phone's flashlight aimed down to give Sarah as much light as possible. "Be careful, Mom." Sarah looked at her daughter, memorizing her face just in case. Then she stepped into the shaft and began to climb down. The descent was terrifying. Each rung of the ladder felt like it might give way at any moment. Rust flaked off under her hands, and more than once her foot slipped, sending her heart into her throat. The shaft was so narrow, her shoulders brushed the walls on either side, and the air grew colder and danker the deeper she went. Above her, Emma's light grew dimmer, until it was just a faint glow in the darkness. Sarah's own flashlight, clutched between her teeth, revealed only the next few feet of ladder and the endless drop below. She counted the rungs as she descended. 20, 30, 40. How deep was level 4? The schematic hadn't indicated the exact depth, and with each rung, Sarah's fear grew that she had made a terrible mistake. So at rung 63, her foot touched something solid. Sarah froze, her heart pounding, then slowly lowered herself until both feet were on what felt like a metal platform. She took the flashlight from her mouth and shone it around. She was standing on a narrow catwalk that ran the length of the shaft. To her left, the catwalk ended at a wall. To her right, it extended to a door, small and unmarked, set into the concrete. Sarah's hands shook as she untied the rope from her waist. "Emma!" she called up the shaft. "I'm okay! I found a door!" Emma's response was faint, barely audible. "Be careful." Sarah approached the door. There was no lock, just a wheel-style handle like those on submarine hatches. She gripped it with both hands and turned. It was stiff, protesting, but it moved. With a shriek of metal on metal, the wheel spun, and the door swung inward. Sarah stepped through into level 4, and her breath caught in her throat. The space was massive, far larger than any of the levels above. Her flashlight beam seemed to shrink in the vastness, barely illuminating the edges of a chamber that stretched into darkness in every direction. But what she could see made her legs go weak. Rows upon rows of metal shelving units, each one stacked with wooden crates and sealed metal containers. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, filling the chamber like a warehouse. And along the far wall, barely visible in the dim light, what looked like vault doors, massive and imposing, their steel surfaces unmarked by time. Sarah took a step forward, then another, her flashlight sweeping across the chamber. The crates were labeled, stenciled with codes and numbers that meant nothing to her. But they were clean, unmarked by rust or decay, as if they had been sealed away from the elements for decades. She approached the nearest crate and found a crowbar leaning against it, as if left there deliberately. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and wedged it under the lid of the crate. The wood creaked in protest, then gave way with a crack that echoed through the chamber. Sarah lifted the lid and shone her light inside. What she saw made her drop the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, spinning, casting wild shadows across walls that suddenly seemed to close in around her. Inside the crate, wrapped in protective cloth and nestled in straw, were paintings. Not prints or reproductions, but original works, their colors vivid even in the dim light, their frames ornate and heavy with age. Sarah's mind refused to process what she was seeing. She picked up the flashlight with shaking hands and looked at the next crate, then the next. Paintings, sculptures, instruments, jewelry. Each crate held treasures that looked like they belonged in museums, not buried in a missile silo in the middle of Wyoming. She moved to one of the vault doors and found it unsealed, the wheel already turned. Inside, on climate-controlled shelves that still hummed with power, sat more treasures. Documents in protective cases, rare books, artifacts she couldn't even identify. Sarah sank to her knees in the middle of the chamber, surrounded by wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined, and felt her mind struggle to comprehend the magnitude of what she had found. Uncle Martin hadn't just lived in this silo. He had been guarding something that must be worth millions, tens of millions, maybe more. Above her, faint through the ventilation shaft, she heard Emma calling, "Mom? Mom, are you okay?" Sarah's voice cracked when she tried to respond. "Em," she called back, tears streaming down her face. "Emma, you need to see this." She stood on shaking legs and moved back to the door, back to the catwalk, where the rope still hung. She gripped it and began to climb, her arms trembling with exhaustion and shock, pulling herself hand over hand up the shaft until she emerged into the dim light of level 3. Emma grabbed her, pulling her away from the shaft. "Mom, what happened? You're crying. Are you hurt?" Sarah looked at her daughter, at the fear and hope mingled in her expression, and couldn't find the words. How could she explain what she'd seen? How could she make Emma understand that everything had just changed? "We need to go back down," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. "Both of us, together. You need to see what's down there." Emma's eyes widened. "Is it bad?" Sarah laughed, the sound verging on hysteria. "No, baby. It's not bad. It's impossible." They descended together, Sarah going first and talking Emma through each step, her daughter moving slowly because of her belly, but never hesitating. When they finally stood together on the catwalk, When Sarah led Emma through the door and into the chamber, her daughter's gasp echoed in the darkness. "Oh my God," Emma whispered. "Mom, what is this?" Sarah moved to the nearest crate and lifted the lid, showing Emma the paintings inside. Then she moved to the next, and the next, some revealing treasures that seemed to multiply with each discovery. Emma's hands flew to her mouth. "Are these real?" "I think so," Sarah said. "I think they're all real." They spent the next hour exploring, opening crates, examining the contents of the vaults, their flashlights revealing wonders that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Paintings by masters whose names Sarah recognized even with her limited knowledge of art. Sculptures of marble and bronze, jewelry that glittered even in the dim light. Documents written in languages she couldn't read, sealed in cases that suggested their immense value. And in one vault, they found something else. A leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. Sarah opened it, and in the first entry, she found her uncle's name. "This is Martin's journal," she said, her voice shaking. They sat together on the floor, Emma leaning against her mother, and Sarah read aloud by flashlight. The journal told a story that seemed impossible, yet explained everything. Martin Hargrove had been a soldier, stationed in Germany after World War II. He had been part of a unit tasked with recovering stolen art, treasures looted by the Nazis and hidden throughout Europe. But some of the art had disappeared, smuggled away by men who saw value only in dollars, not history. Martin had discovered one such smuggling operation, a massive theft orchestrated by American officers who planned to sell the treasures to private collectors. He had intervened, but not through official channels. He hadn't trusted the system, hadn't believed that justice would be served if he reported what he knew. Instead, and he had stolen the stolen art. The journal detailed how he had loaded trucks in the dead of night, how he had shipped crates marked as military equipment back to the United States, how he had hidden them first in warehouses, then in storage units, and finally, in the missile silo he had purchased with the last of his savings. For 40 years he had lived alone, guarding treasures that belonged to families destroyed by war, waiting for a time when he could safely return them. But the years had passed. The families had scattered or died, and Martin had grown old in his isolation, paralyzed by fear of exposure and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. In the final entry, written just weeks before his death, Martin had confessed his greatest regret. He had wanted to make things right, to find the rightful owners, but he had run out of time. Instead, he had left everything to Sarah, the only family he had left, with a simple instruction written in shaking handwriting. "Do what I could not. Give them back their history." Sarah closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Emma was crying too, her hand resting on her belly, on the life growing inside her. "He left this for us to fix," Emma whispered. "He knew we'd find it." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The weight of what her uncle had left them was almost unbearable. This wasn't just wealth. It was responsibility. It was history. It was the stories of countless families, preserved in secret for decades, waiting to be returned. They sat in the darkness of Level 4, surrounded by treasures worth more money than Sarah could even begin to calculate. And Sarah understood with perfect clarity what they had to do. They couldn't keep this. They couldn't sell it. They had to give it back, every piece, to the families and institutions they belonged to, even if it meant staying poor. Even if it meant the struggle continued, even if the world would call them fools for walking away from a fortune. "Mom," Emma said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "What are we going to do?" Sarah looked at her daughter, at the baby growing inside her, at the future that suddenly seemed impossibly complicated. She thought of the clerk in Sweetwater who had shown them kindness, of the locked door that had hidden this secret, of her uncle dying alone, hoping someone would be brave enough to finish what he started. "We're going to do the right thing," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears. "So we're going to give it all back." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. Okay, yeah, that's what we do." They climbed back up the shaft together, leaving the treasures behind. And when they emerged into level 3, Sarah felt something shift inside her. They were still poor. They were still struggling. They still had no idea how they would survive the winter or deliver a baby in a missile silo without medical care. But they had found something more valuable than gold. They had found purpose. They had found a way to turn their uncle's lifetime of regret into something meaningful, something that mattered. Tomorrow, Sarah would drive to Sweetwater, would find a phone that worked, would make the calls that would change everything. She would tell authorities what they had found, would begin the long process of returning the treasures to their rightful owners. Tonight, they sat by the fire on level 1, wrapped in their thin blankets, and Emma drew a new picture. Not of rooms transformed or babies in cribs, but of families reunited with their histories, of museums filled with beauty, of justice served across decades. And Sarah, watching her daughter draw, felt for the first time since they'd lost their home that maybe, just maybe, they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The impossible had found them in the darkness, and they had chosen not to keep it, but to share it with a world that desperately needed to know that integrity still existed, even in the most unlikely of places. The morning after the discovery, Sarah woke with the weight of the world pressing against her chest. Emma slept curled beside her, one hand resting protectively over her belly. And for a long moment, Sarah simply watched her daughter breathe, trying to convince herself that what they had found in level 4 was real and not some fever dream born of desperation. But the journal sat on the floor beside her, its leather cover worn smooth by her uncle's hands, and she knew with absolute certainty that every word written in those pages was true. Below them, sealed behind concrete and steel, lay treasures stolen from families who had suffered unimaginable loss. And now the responsibility to make it right had fallen to a homeless woman living in a decommissioned missile silo with her pregnant teenage daughter. The absurdity of it should have made her laugh. Instead, it made her want to scream. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Emma, and climbed the stairs to ground level. The early morning sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting the barren Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and amber. Sarah stood in the doorway of the silo, breathing in air so cold it burned her lungs, and tried to organize her thoughts into something resembling a plan. She needed to contact authorities. But which authorities? The police would think she was insane. The FBI, Homeland Security. The thought of calling any government agency made her stomach clench with anxiety. She was a woman with no permanent address, no credentials, no proof beyond a crumbling journal, and her word that what lay beneath the earth was real. They would take one look at her, at Emma, at the silo, and assume she was either delusional or running some kind of scam. They might even arrest her for trespassing on government property, despite the deed in her possession. The system had failed her so many times that trusting it now felt like stepping off a cliff. But she had no choice. The treasures in level 4 didn't belong to her. They belonged to history. Sarah walked the 30 miles to Sweetwater, her feet blistering in her worn shoes, her mind rehearsing what she would say. The town was quiet when she arrived, the main street nearly empty except for a few pickups parked outside the diner. She found a payphone outside the general store, one of the few remaining in existence, and fed it the quarters she'd been saving. Her first call was to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The number was listed in Uncle Martin's journal, written in his shaking handwriting with a note beside it. Call them. They'll understand. The phone rang 4 times before a receptionist answered, her voice professional and distant. Holocaust Museum. How may I direct your call? Sarah's throat tightened. I need to speak to someone about stolen art. Art. I found, my uncle had. There's a collection. The words tumbled out incoherently, and she forced herself to stop, to breathe. There was a pause on the other end. Ma'am, can you please slow down and explain what you're calling about? Sarah closed her eyes and tried again. My name is Sarah Bennett. My uncle, Martin Hargrove, recently passed away and left me a property in Wyoming. Inside, I found a collection of art and artifacts that I believe were stolen during World War II. There are documents, a journal. Everything is documented. I need to know what to do. Another pause, longer this time. Can you hold, please? Classical music filled Sarah's ear as she waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Minutes ticked by. She fed more quarters into the phone. Finally, a different voice came on the line. Male this time, with an edge of urgency that hadn't been there before. This is Dr. Nathan Rosen, Director of Art Recovery. I understand you're calling about a possible collection? Sarah repeated her story, this time more slowly, more carefully. She described the silo, the journal, the crates, and vaults in level 4. Dr. Rosen asked questions, his tone shifting from skepticism to sharp interest, as she answered each one with details only someone who had seen the collection could know. Ms. Bennett, he said finally, his voice taut with barely controlled excitement. If what you're describing is accurate, this could be one of the most significant art recoveries in decades. I need to send a team to verify your claims. Can you provide an address? Sarah gave him directions to the silo, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. Dr. Rosen told her to expect representatives within 48 hours and to touch nothing else in the vault until they arrived. She agreed and hung up, then immediately called the county sheriff's office to report the discovery, creating an official record. The sheriff, a man named Tom Reeves, who sounded more curious than concerned, said he'd drive out to take a statement. Sarah gave him the same directions and hung up, then stood by the payphone for several minutes, trying to process what she had just set in motion. Words spread through Sweetwater with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. By the time Sheriff Reeves arrived at the silo late that afternoon, driving a cruiser that kicked up clouds of dust on the access road, 3 other cars had already followed. Local reporters, Sarah realized with growing dread. Small-town journalists who had caught wind of something interesting and smelled a story. Sheriff Reeves was a man in his 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen enough of life to be skeptical of everything. He stepped out of his cruiser and studied the silo with an expression that clearly said he thought he was wasting his time. "You're the woman who inherited this place," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "And you're claiming there's stolen art inside." His tone made it clear what he thought of that claim. Sarah straightened her spine. "I'm not claiming anything, Sheriff. I'm reporting a discovery. There's a sealed level below ground containing art and artifacts that I believe were taken during World War II. I've contacted the appropriate authorities, and they're sending experts to verify." Reeves's eyebrows rose slightly. "Experts? From where?" "The Holocaust Museum in Washington." That got his attention. He studied her more carefully now, taking in her worn clothes, her too thin frame, the desperation she couldn't quite hide. "You understand what you're saying sounds pretty far-fetched." "I understand perfectly, Sheriff, but it's the truth." One of the reporters, a young woman with a camera slung around her neck, called out, "Ms. Bennett, can you tell us what you found? How much is it worth?" Sarah turned to face the small crowd that had gathered. 3 reporters, a handful of curious townspeople, and the clerk from the general store, who stood with her arms crossed, watching Sarah with an expression that might have been concern or might have been judgment. "I can't comment on that right now," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Experts are coming to assess the situation. Until then, I have nothing else to say." Sheriff Reeves gestured toward the silo entrance. "You mind if I take a look?" Sarah led him down, Emma staying behind at the surface, and showed him level 4. She didn't open any of the crates, following Dr. Rosen's instructions, but the sheriff's flashlight beam swept across the rows of containers, the vault doors, and his skepticism visibly crumbled. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, his voice echoing in the chamber. "How long has this been down here?" "According to my uncle's journal, since the 1980s. Reeves shook his head slowly. "And you're just going to hand it all over? You know this could be worth millions." Sarah had been asked that question a dozen times in her own mind. "It's not mine, Sheriff. It never was." When they emerged back into the sunlight, the crowd had grown. More cars lined the access road, more people clustered around the entrance, and Sarah felt the first stirrings of panic. This was spiraling out of her control faster than she could process. The reporters swarmed her with questions she refused to answer. Someone from town, a man she didn't recognize, shouted that she was a fool for not keeping it quiet, and that she could have sold everything and no one would have known. The clerk from the general store snapped back at him, defending Sarah in a way that surprised them both. Emma appeared at Sarah's side, her hand slipping into her mother's, and together they retreated into the silo, shutting the heavy blast door behind them and leaving the chaos outside. That night, they huddled by the fire on level 1, and Emma asked the question Sarah had been avoiding. "What if they don't believe us? What if they think we're lying?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Then we show them the truth, and we keep showing them until they can't deny it anymore." The team from the Holocaust Museum arrived 2 days later in a convoy of black SUVs that looked wildly out of place on the rutted access road. Dr. Nathan Rosen led the group, was a trim man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that burned with fierce intelligence. He was accompanied by art historians, conservators, security personnel, and a representative from the FBI's art crime team. Sarah met them at the entrance, acutely aware of how she must look in her stained clothes, her unwashed hair pulled back in a ponytail, her daughter hovering behind her, looking equally unkempt. But Dr. Rosen's handshake was firm, and his expression held no judgment, only barely contained urgency. "Mrs. Bennett, thank you for making that call. Will you show us?" Sarah led them down to level 4, the group moving in single file through the narrow passages. When she opened the door to the vault chamber and their flashlights illuminated the rows of crates, the silence that fell was absolute. "Doctor." Rosen approached the nearest crate with the careful reverence of a man approaching something sacred. He pulled on white gloves and gently lifted the lid Sarah had pried open days before. His breath caught audibly. "My God," he whispered. "It's a Vermeer, a genuine Vermeer." He turned to his team, his voice shaking. "Get the authentication equipment down here, now." What followed was organized chaos. The team worked with meticulous care, documenting every crate, every item, cross-referencing contents with databases of missing art. Sarah and Emma watched from the sidelines, feeling increasingly like spectators in a story that had grown too large for them to comprehend. One of the conservators, a woman named Dr. Helena Moss, found Sarah on the second day and pulled her aside. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and Sarah realized she had been crying. "Miss Bennett," Helena said, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you understand what you've found? These pieces, they've been missing for over 70 years. Some of them, we thought they were destroyed. Families have been searching for them for generations. You've just rewritten art history." Sarah felt the words settle over her like a weight. "I didn't find them. My uncle did." "But you called us. You could have sold them, disappeared, lived like a queen for the rest of your life. Instead, you chose to give them back." Helena gripped Sarah's hands. "Do you know how rare that is? How extraordinary?" Sarah shook her head, uncomfortable with the praise. "It wasn't mine to keep." The story broke nationally on the third day. Somehow, despite the team's attempts at secrecy, the word had leaked to major news outlets. By evening, satellite trucks lined the access road, their broadcast antennas pointing skyward like strange mechanical trees. Reporters from New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, even international outlets, descended on the remote Wyoming landscape. Sarah refused all interviews at first, overwhelmed by the attention and terrified of saying something wrong. But Dr. Rosen convinced her that telling her story, letting the world know what her uncle had done and what she had chosen to do, was important. The interview aired on a major network news program. Sarah sat in front of cameras, Emma beside her, and told the truth. She talked about being homeless, about inheriting the silo with nothing but hope and desperation. She talked about finding level 4, about her uncle's journal, about the impossible choice that turned out to be no choice at all. When the interviewer asked why she hadn't kept even one piece, Sarah's answer was simple. "Because they belong to families who lost everything. My daughter and I, we've lost a lot too. But we still have each other. These families, they lost people. They lost homes, histories, entire worlds. If giving this back can return even a small piece of what was stolen from them, then that's worth more than any amount of money." The interview went viral. Within hours, Sarah's face was everywhere. Her story shared millions of times across social media. The response was overwhelming. Some praised her integrity. Others called her a fool. But the vast majority of comments expressed something Sarah hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that decency still existed, that people could still choose to do the right thing even when no one was watching. The authentication process took weeks. Experts arrived from museums around the world, each one verifying pieces from their specialties. Paintings were confirmed as originals by masters, whose names Sarah had only heard in passing. Rembrandt, Monet, Van Gogh, Klimt. Sculptures that had graced the homes of wealthy Jewish families before they were seized by the Nazis. Musical instruments played by prodigies who had died in concentration camps. Documents that proved ownership, lineage, history. The total value, when finally calculated, was staggering. $315 million. The number was so large Sarah couldn't comprehend it. That much money could have solved every problem she'd ever had. It could have given Emma the future Sarah had always dreamed of for her. It could have transformed their lives beyond recognition. And she was giving it all away. The town of Sweetwater's reaction shifted dramatically as the scale of the discovery became clear. The people who had looked at Sarah with pity or contempt now looked at her with something like awe. The clerk from the general store, whose name Sarah learned was Ruth, became a fierce defender, turning away reporters who tried to harass them and organizing a collection drive that brought food, supplies, and winter clothes to the silo. "You're one of us now," Ruth said simply when Sarah tried to thank her. "And we take care of our own." The greatest moments came when the families began to arrive. Dr. Rosen and his team had worked tirelessly to trace the provenance of each piece, matching them to the families they had been stolen from. Many of those families no longer existed, their members lost to the Holocaust, but descendants remained, scattered across the globe, and one by one, they made the pilgrimage to Wyoming. An elderly woman named Eva Klein flew in from Tel Aviv. She was 92 years old, her frame bent with age, but her eyes were bright with purpose. Dr. Rosen led her to a painting that had been authenticated as belonging to her family, a landscape that had hung in her childhood home in Vienna before the Nazis came. Eva stood before the painting, her gnarled hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My father hung this above the piano," she whispered. "I used to stare at it while I practiced. I thought I would never see it again. I thought everything was gone." Her grandson, a man in his 40s, stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, his own face wet with tears. "Thank you," he said to Sarah, his voice breaking. "You gave her back a piece of her childhood. You have no idea what this means." But Sarah did know. She saw it in Eva's face, in the way the old woman reached out to touch the frame with trembling fingers, in the stories she told about a life that had been stolen but not forgotten. This was worth more than $300 million. This was worth everything. The families kept coming. A man from Paris who wept over a sculpture his grandmother had created before being sent to Auschwitz. A woman from New York who found her great-grandfather's violin, the instrument he had played in a famous orchestra before the war. Each reunion was a healing of wounds that had festered for decades, a reclamation of heritage that had seemed lost forever. Sarah watched them all, these descendants of tragedy, and felt something inside her shift. Her own suffering, the homelessness and hunger and fear, suddenly seemed part of a larger story. Her uncle had carried the weight of guilt for decades, unable to find the courage to make things right. And now, through a series of events that seemed almost divinely orchestrated, Sarah had been given the chance to complete what he had started. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. Organizations dedicated to recovering stolen art reached out, offering Sarah rewards for the return of the pieces. She refused them all. Foundations offered to name wings after her, to immortalize her contribution. She declined, uncomfortable with the idea of profiting in any way from doing what was simply right. But one offer she couldn't refuse came from the Rothschild Foundation, the same organization that had been instrumental in recovering art for decades. They had followed the story closely, and their representative, a man named David Rothschild, arrived at the silo on a cold December morning. He didn't look like a billionaire philanthropist. He wore jeans and a wool coat and drove himself in a rental car. When Sarah met him at the entrance, he extended his hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "Ms. Bennett, I won't take much of your time. I know you've been overwhelmed. But I wanted to make you an offer in person." Sarah braced herself for another reward she would have to refuse. David gestured to the silo. "This place, it's played an important role in history now. My family's foundation would like to help you transform it into something permanent. A museum and education center dedicated to teaching about the Holocaust, about stolen art, about the importance of doing the right thing. We'd fund the complete renovation, the exhibits, the staff, and we'd like you to run it." Sarah stared at him. "I don't have any experience running a museum. I don't have any qualifications." "You have the most important qualification," David said. "You understand what these pieces mean. You chose integrity over wealth. That's exactly the kind of person we need leading this place." He paused. "There would be a salary, of course, housing for you and your daughter. Full benefits, including health care." Health care. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma was 7 months pregnant now, her belly round and heavy, and they still had no plan for how to deliver the baby. Sarah had been trying not to think about it, trying not to let the fear consume her. "We can have a medical facility on site," David continued, as if reading her mind. "A birthing center, staffed by professionals. Your daughter and the baby would have everything they need." Sarah felt Emma's hand slip into hers, felt her daughter's fingers squeeze tight. She looked at David Rothschild, and saw no pity in his eyes, only respect. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you do this for us?" David's expression grew solemn. "Because my own family lost everything in the Holocaust. Because pieces of our collection were in that vault down there. And because you gave them back without hesitation, even though you had every reason to keep them. The world needs more people like you, Ms. Bennett. This is our way of making sure your story continues to inspire." Sarah couldn't speak. The lump in her throat was too large, the emotions too overwhelming. She simply nodded, and David smiled. The transformation began immediately. Crews arrived to renovate the silo, installing proper electricity, plumbing, heating. The upper levels were converted into museum space, with climate-controlled galleries where reproductions of the recovered art would be displayed alongside the stories of the families they belonged to. The lower levels became administrative offices, a research library, and living quarters for Sarah and Emma that were modest but comfortable. Emma's room had windows that looked out over the Wyoming landscape, walls she painted a soft lavender, and a nursery attached where she could care for the baby. Sarah's room was smaller, but it had a door that locked, a bed with a real mattress, and for the first time in nearly a year, privacy. The birth happened in February in the medical facility that had been built into the silo structure. Emma labored for 18 hours with Sarah at her side, holding her daughter's hand and whispering encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy girl with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced her presence to the world, Sarah wept with relief and joy. Emma named her Hope. "Because that's what you gave me, Mom," she said, cradling the tiny body against her chest. "Even when we had nothing, you gave me hope." The museum opened in the spring, timed to coincide with Holocaust Remembrance Day. Survivors and descendants from around the world attended the ceremony. Ava Klein was there, standing with the support of her grandson, and she placed a hand on Sarah's cheek with a tenderness that made Sarah's eyes sting with tears. "You are a hero," Eva said softly. "Not because of what you gave back, but because of what you chose not to take." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should do." "But most wouldn't," Eva replied. "That's what makes you extraordinary." The local community, once skeptical and judgmental, had transformed as well. Sweetwater had become a destination, tourists stopping to see the famous silo and the museum it had become. The town benefited from the attention, new businesses opening to serve visitors, jobs created, hope restored to a place that had been dying slowly for decades. Ruth from the general store visited often, bringing homemade meals and staying to play with baby Hope. Sheriff Reeves stopped by regularly, no longer in an official capacity, but as a friend. The people who had once looked at Sarah with pity now looked at her with pride, claiming her story as part of their own. On the first anniversary of the discovery, Sarah stood in the main gallery of the museum and looked at the photographs lining the walls. Images of the families reunited with their heritage, of survivors weeping with joy, of children learning about history in a way that made it real and immediate. Emma stood beside her, Hope balanced on her hip, the baby gurgling happily. "Do you ever regret it, Mom?" Emma asked. "Not keeping any of it?" Sarah thought about the question seriously. She thought about the months of being homeless, the fear and hunger and desperation. She thought about what $300 million could have bought them, and then she looked at her daughter, at her granddaughter, at the museum that bore quiet witness to both tragedy and redemption. "No," she said. "Not for a second." That night, after the museum closed and the visitors had gone, Sarah walked through the galleries alone. She paused at a display featuring Uncle Martin's journal, open to the page where he had written his final instructions. "Do what I could not. Give them back their history." She had done it. Against all odds, or against the temptation of wealth beyond measure, against a world that would have understood if she had kept it all for herself. She had done what was right. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Rosen. Another family had been located, another piece of their history about to be returned. The work was never truly finished. There would always be more stories to tell, more families to reunite with their past, more healing to facilitate. But that was okay. Because Sarah had found her purpose in the most unlikely of places, in a missile silo in the middle of nowhere, guarding treasures that had never belonged to her, but had changed her life all the same. She thought of the young woman she had been, sleeping in a car with her pregnant daughter, counting quarters, and wondering how they would survive another day. That woman would barely recognize the person Sarah had become, not because of wealth or fame or recognition, but because she had learned what her uncle had known all along. Some things were more valuable than money: integrity, justice, the chance to heal wounds that had bled for generations, the knowledge that you had looked temptation in the face and chosen the harder path because it was the right one. Sarah turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to the living quarters, where Emma and Hope were already asleep. She stood in the doorway of their rooms, watching them breathe in the warm light of a night light shaped like a star, and felt a peace she had never known settle into her bones. They had survived. More than that, they had prevailed. Not through wealth or luck, but through choosing to be the kind of people who did the right thing when no one was watching, when every incentive pointed the other way, when the world would have forgiven them for taking a different path. The missile silo, once a monument to destruction and the cold calculus of mutually assured annihilation, had become a testament to restoration and the warm arithmetic of human decency. And Sarah Bennett, homeless woman, struggling mother, unlikely guardian of history, had proven that even in the darkest times, integrity still mattered. She closed the door softly and walked to her own room, where a bed waited, warm and safe and hers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new stories to preserve. But tonight, she would sleep without fear, without hunger, without shame. The silo kept its vigil over the Wyoming prairie, its concrete walls holding not weapons of war, but memories of survival, its depths no longer hiding secrets, but sharing truths. And in the quiet darkness, if you listened closely enough, you might hear the echoes of families reunited, of justice finally served, of one woman's choice to do what was right rippling outward into a world that desperately needed to believe that goodness still existed. Sarah had been given 40 acres, a crumbling structure, and a burden too heavy for one person to carry. She had found her strength, claimed her purpose, and in doing so, had given the world something far more valuable than art. She had given it hope. The museum's second summer brought visitors Sarah had never anticipated. Among them was a man named Jakob Weiss, who arrived on a Tuesday morning in June with a photograph so old the edges had begun to disintegrate. He was 78, his hands marked by a lifetime of labor, and when he approached Sarah in the main gallery, his voice trembled with an emotion she had learned to recognize. "I saw the news," he said, holding out the photograph, "about the violin, the Stradivarius that belonged to the Kellerman family." Sarah looked at the image. It showed a young man in formal dress holding a violin, his expression serious, but his eyes bright with youth. Behind him stood a woman and 3 children, all dressed in their finest clothes. "That's my grandfather," Jakob continued. "Isaac Kellerman. He was first violin in the Vienna Philharmonic before everything." His voice cracked. "The violin in your records, the one you found, that was his. Now my father told me stories about it my whole life. He remembered his father playing Brahms on Sunday mornings, the sound filling their apartment, until the neighbors would open their windows to listen. Sarah had heard the violin's history from the archives. It had been authenticated as a 1721 Stradivarius, one of fewer than 600 known to exist, valued at over $8 million on its own. The Rothschild Foundation had already arranged for it to be returned to the Vienna Philharmonic, where it would be played in concerts dedicated to musicians lost in the Holocaust. "Would you like to see it?" Sarah asked softly. "Before it's transferred." Jakob's eyes filled with tears. "Could I?" She led him to the climate-controlled vault, where the most valuable pieces were temporarily stored. The violin rested in a custom case, its wood glowing with a warmth that centuries had only deepened. Sarah opened the case carefully, and Jakob stood before the instrument his grandfather had played, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering above the strings. "Of course." Jakob's fingers, gnarled with age, touched the wood with the reverence of a man touching sacred ground. "My father never learned to play. They took everything before he could. He died when I was 20, and his last words to me were about this violin. He said if I ever found it, I should make sure someone played it again. That music should live even when we couldn't." 2 days later, Sarah arranged something she had no authority to arrange. She contacted the Vienna Philharmonic and requested that before the violin was transferred, one concert be held at the Silo Museum. They agreed, and Jakob Weiss sat in the front row of folding chairs set up in the gallery, while a master violinist played Brahms, the same piece Isaac Kellerman had played on Sunday mornings 80 years ago. Jakob wept through the entire performance. When it ended, he found Sarah and took her hands in his. "My father can rest now," he whispered. "Thank you for giving him peace." These moments became the heartbeat of Sarah's new life. Each family that came brought not just grief, but stories, memories that had survived when everything else had been destroyed. A woman from London brought her grandmother's recipe book and wept when she found a painting that had hung in the kitchen where those recipes were first created. A man from Buenos Aires recognized a sculpture his mother had described in bedtime stories, her way of keeping her lost home alive for her children. Emma navigated her own transformation during those months. At 17, she was both a new mother and a student, having enrolled in online courses to finish her high school degree. Sarah would find her in the early morning hours, Hope sleeping in a bassinet beside her, textbook open on her lap, determination etched into features that had once shown only fear. "I want her to be proud of me," Emma said one night, when Sarah found her studying at 2 in the morning. "I want Hope to grow up knowing her mom didn't give up." "She'll know more than that," Sarah replied, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. "She'll know her mom survived impossible things and still chose kindness." The museum brought unexpected friendships. Dr. Helena Moss, the conservator who had been part of the original authentication team, returned every few months to continue research. She and Sarah developed a relationship that defied their different backgrounds, Helena with her PhD from Oxford, and Sarah with her high school diploma and years of hard survival. But grief and purpose were great equalizers, and they spent long evenings talking about the families, about the weight of history, about the responsibility of remembering. Helena was the one who suggested they create a fellowship program for descendants of Holocaust survivors, bringing them to the museum to learn conservation techniques and art history. "You've created something important here," Helena said. "Not just a museum, but a bridge between past and present, between loss and recovery." The program launched the following year, and 6 young people from around the world came to spend the summer at the silo. They were Emma's age, or slightly older, and watching them work alongside her daughter, all of them carrying histories too heavy for their years, Sarah saw the future taking shape. One of the fellows, a young woman named Miriam, whose great-grandmother had died at Auschwitz, became Emma's closest friend. They would sit together in the evenings, hope playing between them, and talk about legacy, about what it meant to carry the weight of the past into an uncertain future. My grandmother told me I had to be twice as good at everything, because I was representing all the family members who never got the chance, Miriam said one night. Sounded like I had to live enough life for all of them. Emma nodded slowly. I used to feel that way about my mom, like I had to make all her suffering worth something. But I think that's too heavy for anyone to carry. So, what do we do instead? Emma looked at Hope, who had fallen asleep against her chest, tiny fist curled around her finger. We just live. We make good choices when we can. We remember, but we don't let the weight crush us. Sarah, listening from the doorway, felt pride swell in her chest so forcefully it hurt. Her daughter had grown into someone wise beyond her years, someone who understood that survival wasn't just about enduring, but about choosing who you wanted to become. The museum's educational programs expanded. School groups came from across the region. Children who had never thought about the Holocaust, or stolen art, or the importance of doing the right thing when no one was watching. Sarah developed a program where she told her own story, not as a hero's tale, but as a simple truth about choice. I was homeless, she would tell rooms full of teenagers. My daughter and I slept in a car. We were hungry, scared, and desperate. When I found that vault, I had every reason to keep it. No one would have blamed me, but I would have known. And I would have had to teach my daughter that desperation justifies anything. I couldn't do that. The students listened with an attention that surprised their teachers. In a world of influencers and instant gratification, Sarah's story of choosing integrity over wealth resonated in ways that made some of them uncomfortable, and all of them think. One student, a girl about Emma's age, stayed after a presentation and asked, "Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you'd kept it? Even just one painting?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "Yes, I wonder. But then I think about the families I've met, the people who got pieces of their history back, and I know I made the right choice. Even though you're you're not rich now, right? I have a job I love, a home, health care for my family, and the knowledge that I did something that mattered. That's a kind of wealth most rich people never find." The girl nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from her. She had started volunteering at a local homeless shelter, inspired by Sarah's story. "You showed me that the person you become matters more than the things you have," she wrote. "I want to be someone who helps, not just someone who succeeds." The letters came often now, from students, from families, from people who had heard Sarah's story and felt compelled to share their own. She kept them in a box in her office, reading them when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy. They reminded her that the ripples of one choice could spread farther than she ever imagined. Sheriff Reeves became a regular fixture at the museum, bringing his grandchildren to visit and always stopping by Sarah's office to chat. Their relationship had evolved from professional to genuine friendship, and he confessed one afternoon that her story had changed how he approached his job. "Used to think everything was black and white," he said, and sipping coffee in her small office, while Hope played with blocks on the floor. "You break the law, you face consequences. But your uncle, he broke laws. He stole stolen art. And yet, what he did, what you finished, that was justice in a way the legal system never could have provided." "I think he struggled with that his whole life," Sarah replied. "The journal shows how torn he was. He knew he'd broken laws, but he also knew the system had failed those families. Sometimes doing the right thing means operating outside the rules." "Dangerous philosophy for a sheriff to agree with," Reeves said with a small smile. "But I've learned there's letter of the law and spirit of the law. You honored the spirit. The museum's success brought challenges Sarah hadn't anticipated. As word spread, people began arriving claiming connections to pieces in the collection, some legitimate, others clearly attempting to capitalize on the discovery. Sarah worked closely with Dr. Rosen and his team to verify every claim, refusing to return pieces without absolute certainty of provenance. One case particularly troubled her. A man arrived from Switzerland, claiming that a Klimt painting belonged to his family, presenting documents that appeared authentic. But something about his story felt wrong, inconsistencies in the timeline, gaps in the documentation. Sarah pushed for further investigation, despite pressure to simply return the piece and close the case. 2 months of research revealed the truth. The man was a con artist who had stolen the identity of the actual descendant, hoping to claim the painting and sell it. The real family member, to an elderly woman living in Israel, knew nothing about the claim until Dr. Rosen contacted her. The incident taught Sarah that even in work aimed at justice, there were people who would try to exploit tragedy for profit. It hardened something in her, made her more cautious, more willing to question. But it also reinforced why the work mattered. Someone had to stand guard over these recovered memories, protecting them from those who saw only dollar signs. Emma graduated from high school in a small ceremony held at the museum. She walked across a makeshift stage in the main gallery, Hope toddling beside her grandmother, and received her diploma from the online program she'd completed, while raising a baby and working part-time in the museum's education department. Ruth from Sweetwater brought a cake. Helena Moss flew in from London, and Sheriff Reeves and half the town attended. When Emma gave her brief speech, she spoke about the silo. When my mom and I first came here, I thought this place was the end of the world, a concrete tomb where we'd hide from life. But it became the beginning instead. This building taught me that what looks like a dead end can be a doorway, that the hardest choices are usually the right ones. And that home isn't a place, it's the people who choose to love you even when you have nothing to offer but yourself. Sarah cried through the entire speech, pride and relief mingling with the ever-present awareness of how close they had come to a different ending. The summer hope turned 2. The museum hosted its largest event yet, an international symposium on art recovery and restitution. Art experts from dozens of countries gathered in the renovated silo to share research, discuss legal frameworks, and honor the work of people like Martin Hargrove, who had preserved pieces of history at great personal cost. Sarah was asked to give the keynote address. Standing before hundreds of scholars, museum directors, and government officials, she felt the familiar flutter of inadequacy. She had no degrees, no formal training, no credentials beyond having made one good choice when it mattered most. But when she began to speak, telling the story of the discovery and the decision to return everything, the room fell absolutely silent. She talked about her uncle's burden, about the families who had reclaimed their heritage, about the responsibility they all shared to ensure that stolen beauty was returned to its rightful place. My uncle spent 40 years paralyzed by fear, she concluded. Fear of the legal consequences, fear of making mistakes, fear of the enormity of what he'd taken on. That fear kept these pieces locked in darkness when they should have been bringing joy, teaching history, connecting people to their past. I don't want fear to win anymore. Not for stolen art, not for stolen lives, not for any of us. We have to be braver than our fears and more committed to justice than to comfort. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Afterward, a woman approached her, elderly and elegant, and introduced herself as the director of the Louvre. "Ms. Bennett," she said, "what you've done here goes beyond art recovery. You've created a model for how institutions should approach restitution. We'd like to partner with your museum to learn from your processes, Would you be willing to consult? Sarah agreed, and over the following year, she traveled to Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, always bringing Emma and hope, turning the trips into education for her daughter and granddaughter. They stood before paintings in the world's greatest museums, and Sarah would whisper the stories of the families those paintings belonged to, making sure Emma understood that beauty and tragedy were often intertwined. The work was never finished. New leads emerged constantly, new families discovering that pieces of their history had been in the vault. The museum continued to grow, adding wings and programs, becoming not just a repository of returned art, but a living center for education and healing. On the 3rd anniversary of the discovery, Sarah stood in the gallery late at night, the museum empty and quiet. She looked at the photographs on the walls, the faces of survivors and descendants, the images of paintings returned and histories reclaimed. Hope slept upstairs, Emma studying for her college courses in early childhood education, and Sarah felt the weight of the journey settle into something like peace. She thought about the woman she had been, sleeping in a Honda Civic with her pregnant daughter, believing the world had forgotten them. She thought about the choice she had made in Level 4, standing among treasures that could have solved every problem, and choosing to give them away. It had seemed impossible at the time, foolish even. But standing here now, seeing the lives changed and the memories honored, Sarah understood that some acts of integrity compound, like interest in a savings account. The returns weren't immediate or obvious, but they accumulated over time into something far more valuable than wealth. The silo had been built to house weapons of destruction. Martin Hargrove had repurposed it as a vault of preservation, and Sarah had transformed it into a sanctuary of restoration. Each generation had taken something broken and made it into something meaningful. She walked to her office and pulled out the box of letters, reading a few in the quiet darkness. A child who had decided to become an art historian after visiting the museum. A survivor who had found peace after seeing a family heirloom returned. A teacher who had redesigned her curriculum around the story of the silo and the importance of moral courage. The ripples continued to spread, touching lives Sarah would never know and changing futures she could never witness. And that, she thought, was the truest measure of whether a choice had been right. Not what it cost you, but what it gave to the world. She turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to her apartment, to the daughter and granddaughter waiting, to the life she had built from nothing but the courage to do what was right, when everything in her screamed to do what was easy. The missile silo stood silent under the Wyoming stars, no longer a monument to the past, but a beacon for the future, proving that even in the darkest places, even in the most desperate moments, integrity could transform everything it touched. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.